Welcome to the April All-America City Award Promising Practices webinar. We're very excited to have you all here with us today. But my name is Rebecca Trout, and I am the director of the League's All-America City Award program, as well as our DC office. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know your name and where you're calling in from. So before we dive into today's topic, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on the League and our webinar series. So the mission of the National Civic League is to advance civic engagement to create more equitable and thriving communities. And we were founded way back when in 1894 by a group of reformists led by Teddy Roosevelt and Louis Brandeis, making us the oldest good governance organization in the country. We championed many of the democracy innovations of the early 20th century, and we're trying to do so again today. So right now, the League completes our mission through maintaining our model city charter, organizing the All-America City Award, and publishing our quarterly journal, the National Civic Review. We also have a Center for Democracy Innovation that works with public officials across the US to understand, test, and disseminate the next generation of civic innovations that we hope will have the potential of making democracy more participatory, equitable, and ultimately more productive. So before I hand it over to today's moderators who are going to talk about one of those civic innovations, I just want to go over a couple of reminders and housekeeping rules. So the slides and a recording of today's webinar will be emailed out to you. So don't feel like you need to feverishly take notes. We will also have time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. So please remain muted while our presenters are speaking, but put any chats that arise into the chat box, and then we'll also allow for the raise hand feature at the end of the webinar. So now I am going to hand it over to today's moderator, Matt Stempick. Matt?
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks National Civic League for having us. It's an honor to be with Justice Brandeis and Teddy Roosevelt Company. Thank you all for attending. My name is Matt Stempeck, and I'm joined today by my colleagues who you can see here, Greta Byram and Yongchuan Wu, representing Etica's Foundation, Marika Pfefferkorn and Clarence Oko, representing the Notice Coalition, and Eloise Gabadou, not pictured on the Civic Tech Field Guide team. So I'm with the Civic Tech Field Guide, which is a crowdsourced knowledge base of tools, programs, organizations, all fighting for our democracy like National Civic League, including several hundred projects focused on cities, and we collaborate with National Civic League. The work we're sharing today on AI audits is funded by Next Generation Internet Search, which is an EU program, and it's a collaboration between the Civic Tech Field Guide and Etica's. So as AI systems get rolled out to us, both as consumers and citizens, they obviously expand capacity, but they also introduce new sets of questions and concerns about performance, trust, and management. And as a former campaigner, I'm always keeping my eye out on strategies that communities can use to build power. AI auditing, when I learned about it, which was fairly recently, it struck me as an instance, the rare instance of a new method that communities can use and campaigners can use. It's an emerging science where we test how AI tools perform in the real world rather than relying on the lofty principles that we've seen published. So we teamed up with Etica's to apply their work conducting community-led audits to civic and public sector use cases, which Greta will discuss. Just quickly, what we're going to cover today, we'll explore what AI audits are and why they matter, a real-world case study of auditing public sector AI, and an overview of what actually happens and occurs during the auditing process. By the end of this webinar, you should gain an understanding of the importance and benefits of testing AI systems, some practical ways that you can engage your communities on AI usage, and then lastly, a set of free tools and things you can use to evaluate the quality and performance of AI systems. We're going to have time for questions at the end, so please drop them in the chat as we go. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Greta to share more about what AI auditing is and how it can help you.
Thanks so much, Matt, and thank you to the National Civic League for holding this event today. I'm going to start us out by just getting everybody on the same page by talking about the sort of three main clusters of AI. types of AI that are out in the world. So, number one, um, benefits, so predictive and automated decision-making tools. So these are tools that produce scores. They make eligibility determinations. They increase systems efficiency. So these are sort of database tools, and they've been around for a little while. Secondly, we have biometric tools. So these are things like face identification tools, voice prints, iris scans, which are now being applied increasingly to security and access protocols. So everything from how you get through a gate in the airport to how you might access, your banking app on your phone. And then finally, what I think we're most familiar with in the recent year or two, the most recent year or two, is generative AI. So these are AI tools that can generate text, code, and images. So these are chatbots or translation tools, document processing. Um, and just to be clear, these are sort of three buckets of AI. It's a lot more complicated than that, and these kinds of tools can all be used in kind of like interwoven ways, integrated ways. So it's a complicated picture, but I always find it's important to start with the basics. So let's move ahead. And so AI, all these amazing tools we have, they deal with really important social issues and social questions. And while they offer so much potential to uh, increase efficiency, create new ways of doing things that we've never had before, just sort of unlimited potential, they also carry risks. And so that can be everything from bias that is in the data that trains our AI models, biased outputs that come out of the models. They can create hallucinations. Sometimes AI is applied with a lack of understanding of the social context. Um, they can have leaky data. So sometimes folks bring in AI tools without thinking about or understanding necessarily that their data could disappear, as it did in the case of the LA Unified School District's chatbot, where they lost a bunch of student data when the company collapsed. Um, to just maybe there are third-party companies that have access to data via an AI tool or provider. So, overall, we've seen, as this is a very new field, with many folks involved having the very best intentions, that nevertheless there can be a lack of accountability and things can go wrong. So let's go ahead. So, that has led to the development of a kind of new science, which is AI auditing. And it's a new science in the sense that I think like the very best minds in the world are working right now on figuring out how do we test AI in a systematic way? How do we create protocols for testing AI that will ensure that these systems are legal, safe, and compliant with regulatory frameworks and laws? So auditors may examine code or look at the data that was used to build the model or the data it produces. They'll look at the performance of the model. However, at this point in time, most audits, so most of these sort of almost technocratic audits, do not include collaboration with the affected communities, or sometimes don't even look at the kind of impact that use of AI is having on the ground. And so we are having this conversation today to talk about that very issue, with the belief that audits or investigations of AI can be much more powerful and effective if we do consult with those who are feeling the impact of the use of these tools. Go ahead, Matt. So finally, just want to say again, like many of these AI systems that are coming out recently haven't been tested in the real world. And so they are being tested as they're rolled out in situ. And so there may be unintended consequences, even with the very best intentions. And we've also seen with kind of all the hype around generative AI in the last couple of years that aggressive marketing, when you have marketing that says like these AI tools are going to solve all your problems, sometimes people feel like the straightest line to what they want is the use of AI, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes the problem is not one that can be addressed with the AI tool that's offered. And finally, I think it's important to say that there's been a lot of debate about whether or not um, communities can meaningfully participate in AI investigations. Not the sort of assumption underlying that is the sense that, oh, maybe communities don't understand this technology. And so we're here today with the hypothesis, or really, I'd say the argument that you can't actually investigate AI fully unless you do communicate or you do collaborate and partner with the communities who are most affected. And so I'm going to hand it off to Young Shen, who's going to talk about one audit at Etikas. That Hi there. If somebody has their mic on, if you could please mute. Oh, sorry. Was it you, Young?
Yeah, sorry, it was me.
Take it away.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Greta. Apologies for some background noises. I hope it's not too loud. So yes, I want to talk about a case that Etica's Foundation has conducted around 2 to 3 years ago on the system of VOHAN, and I wish to use this case to let people know exactly how we can actually audit an AI system with affected communities in mind. Apart from like just talking about the methodology, which can be quite abstract, I want to focus on what we did before and also telling you exactly how you could be engaging with communities and leveraging their expertise and knowledge. So let's start with introducing the case a little bit. The VOHAN system is a gender violence risk assessment tool used by the Spanish police. It's deployed and developed by the Spanish Ministry of Interior a few years back, and it's been in use for several years. And this year, actually, BBC just released an article on a case that happened this January. A woman went to the police, Spanish police, explaining that she might be facing certain risks with gender violence at home. And then the police algorithm ranked her as only being medium in terms of like risk level. And then she was killed afterwards. So this actually raised the question of how exactly we could approach these algorithmic systems. How do we audit it? And how do we understand how it actually impacts the real life of affected communities? So a little bit about the system itself. Um, the gender violence risk assessment tool basically takes in 35 different indicators of potential risk for gender violence. When a victim goes to report to the Spanish police, they will be asked 35 different questions of the presence of these indicators. And then the algorithm will automatically calculate the likelihood of the victim being attacked by the same perpetrator again. And there were several problems that we already identified before going into the case itself. The first is automation bias. There have been studies produced by other scholars on the system saying that almost 95% of the police officers or the civic guards that use the system will follow the risk assessment produced by the system instead of updating the risk level assigned to victims manually. And that leads to the fact that this system, while it's not automatically deciding how exactly how likely a victim is going to be attacked again, it actually effectively becomes the base of or the foundation of any judgment. And this has massive implications for the affected communities because police will use this system to allocate resources as to do we need to follow up with this woman? How often do we have to follow up with the victim? And if we need to actually give any restraint orders or protection to the victim for a long period of time. There are also other problems, including the lack of external validation and transparency. There were no researchers that were not from the ministry or or contacted by the ministry that could access the source code and understand the internal workings of the system itself. And lastly, we also identified that there was a huge lack of engagement to understand the perspectives of the victims. I want to clarify on the term of affected communities right here. What we meant is any communities that could be affected by the implementation of an algorithmic system, and in this case, it will be gender violence victim survivors. And next slide, please. So, on the broad level, we usually conduct an audit in two different phases with the planning and then execution, and we follow three steps in general. The first step is to make the community's needs visible. And how we do that is by interacting with the communities or community organizations representing the affected people to map out their precise risks and concerns of the AI system in discussion. And then we try to, from all of this interaction and interviews, we try to identify the right audit research question while also confirming with the affected communities, does this address what they wanted us to investigate? Then second, we will start creating an audit plan. And this would also be co-defined and co-designed with the affected communities. We will choose the right methodology to approach an algorithmic system. Sometimes there are some fancy terms like sock puppeting, which is to create a fake account to interact with the algorithmic system so that we can gather a lot of data. But that's only one way to do it. There are also different ways. For instance, like if we collaborate with the AI developers, then we will usually ask them for either source code or their training data to go through and then see if any of them can be potentially problematic for the affected communities. After creating the audit plan, we move on to conducting the audit plan. And usually this entails we collect a lot of input data, which can be coming from the affected communities, or it could be, as previously said, from sock puppet accounts, like fake accounts. And what we do is we try to interact with the system to get the system to produce, say, predictions, classifications, and we compare the performance and behavior of the system across different demographic groups or whichever variables that we choose to test. And finally, and the most importantly, is that when we test the performances, we always want to locate the source of the problem back into the system itself, trying to understand, is it the training data that went wrong? Is it the implementation that went wrong? Or is it the model itself? And next slide, please. So here, I want to tell you how exactly we approach the VOHAN case while telling you also what can be done to engage with the communities meaningfully. First of all, we identified a community organization called Annabella Foundation, who already worked very closely with gender violence victims for years. So there was an extent network that they have, and they also have a lot of domain expertise on the case. Then we identify stakeholders who play a role in the system. Here, it's useful to know that the affected groups and the users of the system are quite different. The users are actually the police officers, the social services, and Ministry of Justice and judiciaries that interact with the system itself. But the affected groups are the victims reporting to the police, coming into police station talking about their cases. And what we could do to engage with communities effectively at this stage is to establish direct contacts with community organizations or advisory boards so that we can invite them to the table, have them talk about their concerns, and we can potentially use that to create an audit plan later on. And then this will also allow us to surface potential biases and harms based on firsthand community experiences. That will allow us to ask the right question that we want to investigate when we conduct the audit. And finally, an important step is to understand precisely who is involved in the algorithmic system, who gets to take action when the algorithm produces an output, and who gets affected. This helps us to understand both the workflow of the system and differentiate between users and affected groups. Next slide, please. After making communities' needs visible, what we need to do right now is to create an audit plan that can help us effectively investigate the algorithm or the algorithmic system. So what we did was we identified public records that could be suitable for reverse engineering. At this time, we did not collaborate with the Spanish ministry because of logistical issues. But what we could do is we identify public records that could help us not only understand the performance of the algorithm system itself, but also the wider social impacts that the algorithm has produced. I will talk to you a little bit about the data set and why that is later. And on our side, we provided the technical know-how to do the quantitative testing, et cetera. But then when working with Annabella Foundation, who has domain expertise, we worked with their gender balance expert to review all the interview questions so that we can talk to the victims who have submitted or interacted with the system before. And at this part, what's very important for an auditor and anyone involved in the audit itself is to understand that it's not just the technical auditors that has expertise. It's a lot of times the affected communities that have first-hand experience and practical knowledge and know-how about how to interact with the system itself. And especially by collaborating with community organizations, we could leverage their existing trust and network to find interviewees. In this case, it's really fortunate for us to have worked with Annabella Foundation, because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to access the individual victims that might be harmed by the system itself. And finally, you could also invite community to co-design research methods instead of simply asking the community to provide data of themselves. That enables them to have a degree of agency and have a degree of say in terms of what research questions we should address. Then finally comes the execution part. Could we go to the next slide, please? So, what Ethicus did at that point was to perform both quantitative and qualitative analysis. On the quantitative side, what we did was a statistical analysis of publicly available data set on intimate partner homicide. What we did was to compare in the database of cases where the victims were murdered, how many of them actually reported through VOHIN and were assigned a risk score. And apart from unlike the original studies produced by other scholars, what we did was we stratified the victims based on different factors. For instance, like if they have small children or not, if they belong to minority groups or not, and if they have certain nationalities. And we tried to compare the performance of the algorithmic system across different groups to understand, does the system actually have hidden biases and discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. Furthermore, to confirm a lot of our suspicions and hypothesis about the system, we interviewed with 31 women survivors who have interacted with the system within a time frame. We also talked to 7 lawyers and 2 civil society representatives who are experts on the matter. And what we found was shocking in terms of the experiences of the victims themselves and how that actually affected the performance of the algorithm. So, for one, most of the victims that came to the police, they were interviewed right after they suffered from these gender violence episodes, and that made yes, and that made them, usually they were put in a state of shock and they were not able to fully grasp exactly how to interact with the algorithmic systems. And a lot of times they actually don't understand that they were interacting, or their answers were being submitted to the system itself. Then in this state, they could not actually provide accurate answers, but this would affect how the police treat their cases and allocate resources. There was also the lack of psychological and legal support for them, as when they were making complaints, they had the right to actually have a lawyer or psychological support in framing their cases so that they would get attention and get sufficient resources. But that was absent when it was submitted to the VOHAN system itself. And finally, there was the nature of the questions asked. A lot of victims reported to us that the questions of the VOHAN system was quite rigid, ambiguous, and at the same time, not allowing them to explicate a lot of their intricacies in cases a lot more. So what we imagine that policymakers or politicians like you or civic leaders like you can do is to, at this stage, work with the communities in testing the algorithm system, translate the technical findings into actual meaningful insights, and figure out what do these findings mean to affected communities. And then another important point is in the implementation of any algorithmic system, it's always important to ensure meaningful human intervention instead of treating AI predictions as the decisive factor for any decisions. They should be treated as merely suggestions, and there should be humans revising such suggestions. And lastly, there should be mitigation steps taken in line with communities' needs and concerns as outlined from previous stages. With this, I will conclude the case, and please feel free to ask me any question afterwards.
Thank you, Yangshan. And now I'm going to turn it over to Clarence and Marika, who we're working with right now in a US context to develop an audit on surveillance tech affecting students in schools. Clarence and Marika, I can't remember who's going first.
No problems. I can kick us off.
Thanks.
Hey, everybody. So as Matt mentioned, my name is Clarence. I'm here with Marika, and we're going to talk a little bit about really expanding the conversation that we've been having and really focusing on what does it look like when algorithmic harms go untreated within communities, and really emphasizing the point that's been made continuously throughout today's presentations, that working on front-end prevention through community collaboration is a far more effective approach than allowing for these harms to happen and then redressing them on the back end. But before we get into all that, we can go to the next slide. So I will allow Marika to introduce herself. I'll do some quick introductions and then we'll get into it.
Greetings, everyone, from the Twin Cities of Minnesota. I am the co-founder of the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance and the executive director of the Midwest Center for School Transformation, and also a co-founder of the Notice Coalition, which stands for No Tech Criminalization in Education. Notice Coalition, co-founder with Clarence Oko. I'll pass it back to you, Clarence.
My name is Clarence, based in Washington, D.C. I'm a civil and human rights attorney, currently working at the Georgetown Law Center on privacy and technology, where much of my work focuses on the civil and human rights implications of emerging technologies for historically vulnerable communities. So we can go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about Notice, which Marika, I don't know if you want to tell them about what Notice does.
Yeah, so Clarence and I started off having a conversation about there was not a lot of representation of folks that were addressing surveillance technologies at the grassroots level. And so we decided that we needed to focus on building out community and infrastructure that can be responsive through tech and digital policy development and systems transformation. So we have a cross collaboration of folks that are researchers, legal, policy practitioners that are really working with communities and individuals on the ground to make sure that vulnerable youth and their families are protected and engaged and equipped to navigate these times.
Oh, we can go to the next
slide, please.
Yep. So as mentioned before, like what we really want to talk about is the kind of missing perspective of communities when it comes to tech and digital policy. And in particular, what we really want to emphasize is that we are seeing around the country a proliferation of algorithmic harms as we see policymakers uncritically adopt these technologies without understanding the way in which these systems affect individuals' rights and freedoms. And so what we want to really foreground in this conversation is what goes wrong, quite frankly, when communities aren't engaged in the process, when we don't develop the types of infrastructures that are necessary to facilitate community engagement in AI and digital policy in meaningful ways. And so with that, we can go to the next slide real quick. So before we get into some of the community examples, we want to walk you through a series of case studies to really ground this conversation. Just wanted to really emphasize that community engagement is not only just a feel-good thing when it comes to AI and digital policy, but it is a recognized best practice. There are a variety of really influential federal policy frameworks that have called for community consultation and community engagement across the AI lifecycle. What you're seeing here is a quote from the White House Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which was released in the previous administration. It really talks about the need for community engagement with diverse stakeholders, because obviously community is not a monolith, so it can look like there are a variety of different perspectives. We want to make sure are engaged in this process. But all of that to say is that community engagement should be integrated throughout the AI lifecycle, and that we are seeing many other influential policy frameworks really emphasize the need for this type of collaboration. So we can go to the next slide. So in terms of what can go wrong, like I said, we're going to try and provide some quick case studies in terms of what has gone wrong and really try to leverage those case studies to identify some key insights and takeaways that civil society and policymakers can be thinking about in these conversations. So I will turn it over now to Marika to kick us off with the first case study.
Thank you, Clarence. So we like to call this case study the cradle to prison algorithm that happened in our community here in the Twin Cities with Ramsey County, the city of St. Paul, and St. Paul Public Schools. Next slide, please. So I would like you all to kind of take a look at this slide and think in your head, what kind of reactions do you get when you look at that? This is an actual document that was presented across a county commission meeting, a city meeting, and a school board meeting to present the timeline and framework for how they were going to introduce and implement a joint powers agreement and predictive analytics process to identify young people that were at risk for being involved in the juvenile justice system. Their goal ultimately was to actually approach it through an upstream lens. And this proposal came from the county prosecutor's office in Ramsey County because they were trying to address and reduce the amount of young people that were involved in the juvenile justice system. So there's a lot of points of entry in this model of how they laid out the work plan for it. But what you'll see first is that they applied for a grant. To actually support the work around developing a framework for predictive analytics in an interoperable system across all of these communities. When I say community systems, so Ramsey County had Child Protection Services, it had the county prosecutor's office, it had Health and Human Services, it had all kinds of juvenile justice, other pieces, St. Paul Public Schools, the city, housing, policing, all of these different departments, and saying, how can we better collaborate and talk about what's going on to be proactive and prevent young people from being involved in juvenile justice? The challenge that I see and experienced as a community member in this community was that you'll see there in the middle, this was launched in 2014. And up until about 2015 across the year, there was no conversation with community. And when I say community, it is parents of students in the schools and their families, it's students, it's educators, it's social workers, it's different departments across all of these systems. So they had a one and done community engagement process where they said, if you were going to make a difference in the life of a young person and prevent them from being involved in the juvenile justice system, what would you do? Rather than actually communicating with the community that they had an idea, they had an agenda that they'd like to pilot. So the community was asked to participate, but the outcome from the community engagement did not align with the grant that was submitted to fund this project. And after they engaged with the community, they submitted a report, one and done. And so they continued with the process. And it wasn't again until about 2017 where the community became aware of what happened based on that community engagement session and that grant. And the community was frustrated because they didn't feel like they were authentically invited in to participate in the process. And what they found was that the result was this framework that would use a number of indicators that would say this child is more likely to be involved in the juvenile justice system. Had they engaged with the community much earlier, they would have registered that the indicators that they were proposing fundamentally were biased. So that year, the Human Rights Department in the state of Minnesota identified 43 school districts for discriminating in the out-of-school suspensions of Black and Brown students. And one of the primary indicators that they used as this system to flag students at risk was whether they had an out-of-school suspension. So right now, when you're putting bad data in, because folks were discriminating against a particular group of students, you put that information in, they're more likely to be flagged, and they're also more likely to be targeted as well as determined a threat. And a number of the other indicators that they were proposing to use to identify who was at risk were very similar to that same protocol. So first, the community was frustrated that they were not truly engaged about solutions. And then secondly, they were not engaged again until decisions had been made. And those decisions had a greater potential to harm than support and serve the community that was intended. So there's a number of intersection points where the community should have been engaged. And the community had a number of questions that the committees and these system actors were not able to answer. So one of the primary questions that they had was, after you flag the student using this technology, on the other side of it, what would be different? They could not answer the question. The answer was, we will go out, send a social worker to the school or to the family's home and give them a list of resources that could potentially support them. But again, when you think about community perspective and social workers and educators, they have a really good sense of what's going on with their students. And so they already knew that students were experiencing trauma or these other pieces. They didn't actually need this algorithm to do that. What they needed were alternative resources and ways to support students in different ways, not to actually flag the students. So what you see is a community that organized against the system after significant resources had been invested in this particular approach. And at the end of the day, they ended up dissolving the joint powers agreement because there were so many problems that they had not thought through or collaborated with the community to think through and process, that they actually ended up, again, dissolving it because they had gotten too far in the process to reroute, to correct, or reimagine what it could possibly be to do this work. What did come out of this process is that the systems recognized they had to have a better model of working with communities. And an advisory was created with community members who went through a training and a support system so that they could engage fully with the systems and provide feedback directly as these ideas were percolating before the grants had been submitted, before the department had taken on the task, to say, what are the questions that we can ask? What are the questions that we have? And in a much more productive and preemptive way of thinking through, how do we determine if this is the right fit? I'll pass it over to you, Clarence.
Cool. So Marika just shared, we can go to the next slide. Marika just shared what happens when the community is able, even after they were excluded, when the community is able to engage on the front end, how they can disrupt and end a problematic program. We're going to actually show you another example of a very similar program that actually went into effect. So I'm going to talk for just really briefly about predictive policing in Pasco County schools. We can go to the next slide. So in Pasco County, Florida, which is right outside of Tampa Bay, for a number of years, the sheriff's office had been working with the school district to implement this secret predictive policing program. It was developed in total secrecy. The way that it worked was that the sheriff's office would gain access, was provided access to confidential student records. And you can see the types of data that they had access to: students' grades, GPAs, histories of childhood trauma and abuse, as well as whether or not their families had been victimized, whether they had been had run away from home. All of these types of data were being aggregated into this very rudimentary risk assessment algorithm. What we found through our investigation, through the Pasco Coalition, which I'll talk about really quickly, we found that there were over 18,000 children in this community that had their data being analyzed by the sheriff's office, and hundreds of students were being placed on secret lists in which sheriff's office officials would go to their homes at all hours of the day and night. For home visitations, they would come up with arbitrary civil citations. The program was designed to basically put so much pressure on kids who were labeled as at risk by their risk assessment algorithm. They would harass them to such an extent that they would be pressured to move or sue from the county. And that's a direct quote from one of the officers. So we did not learn about this program until a series of investigative reporters at the Tampa Bay Times, the article you can see there is on the presentation, until a series of reporters from the Tampa Bay Times did an investigation and really blew the whistle, identifying that this program had been in place for a number of years in the community. We learned about this issue at the time I was at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund as a litigator. We learned about this issue because we saw educators and parents go to school board meetings after the story had broke. And this was in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, to raise their concerns, to mention everything that Marika said, that this is an egregious violation of students' rights, that the data that are being collected are going to be racially disparate and going to produce other forms of structural disadvantage for students who come from marginalized and vulnerable communities. They had raised these concerns. And we, as National Civil Rights Organization started working with a variety of other folks in that community, local civil society organizations, working with parents and educators, working with a variety of folks to really develop a kind of comprehensive advocacy strategy to be able to challenge what we were seeing. We can go to the next slide. So over the course of about 3 years of our investigation and campaign work through the coalition, we were able to achieve a lot of really promising victories. But unfortunately, like the consequences that this had for young people and the consequences, quite frankly, that it had for this community were still devastating. Again, over 18,000 young people were impacted by this program. The community literally had to be investigated by multiple federal agencies, including the Department of Justice, which entered into a historic civil rights agreement with the county. We saw a termination of philanthropic and federal grants as a consequence. We saw a federal court actually hold that the predictive policing program had violated the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. The sheriff's office was sued by the coalition for improperly withholding public records related to this program. And we saw congressional inquiries, as well as inquiries from the Department of Education looking into the FERPA implications of these practices. So this just kind of shows, is a really high level what it looks like when community voices and concerns are just entirely closed out from the decision-making process. If you don't have to deal with those consequences on the front end, you deal with them on the back end, and this, unfortunately, is what happened. And we're seeing this in other contexts as well. We can go to the next slide. As Marika had already previewed, we are working with the folks on this call are working to conduct a community AI audit of vape surveillance technologies in public schools in Minnesota. We can go to the next slide. Encourage folks to read the resource that we developed last year through the Notice Coalition that really highlights this kind of growing issue around vape detection technologies that are being deployed in schools. Our research in Minnesota found that there are over 400,000 kids who are in a school district that has an AI vape detection sensor, and that since these technologies became prominent in the state, we've seen about 121% increase in kids who are being disciplined for tobacco use. We can go to the next slide. And I'll just kick us off really quick here by saying, like, what that work has allowed for us to do is really think about how we can engage in a more rigorous evaluation of what these technologies, how these technologies are impacting young people. What are the consequences of these egregious surveillance practices? What do they mean for young people in their lives? And that's what we're really excited to surface through this community AI audit that we're doing in collaboration with the partners on this call. We can go to the next slide, and I'll just invite Marika to share any high-level thoughts, reflections, insights about any of the work.
If there's any takeaways from this conversation, the goal is to be proactive, not reactive. And so engaging diverse community stakeholders at the earliest to avoid missteps, furthering distrust between systems and communities, and thinking about what are alternatives to the technology if there are ones. One of the challenges that we had was oftentimes our technical policymakers always said the community was not smart enough to understand, and that was why they did not ask them to participate. And what we found is with the right resources, communities understand and they want to engage and they want to participate. We do not need to defer to technical assistance. Many of the policymakers themselves did not have a true understanding of the technology that they were supporting and proposing. And one of the key takeaways that we continue to work on and notice in the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance is actually developing infrastructure to make tech and digital justice accessible, meaning engaging with the community on the ideas, the concepts, and learning about the terminology and the practices in advance so that we can actually, on equal footing, engage with each other as we explore the options of technological solutions that need to actually benefit our communities, not just surveil them. So they are available for direct consultations. We held town halls, we did learning summits. There are ways to actually engage the community in a respectful and effective manner. All right, next slide.
There we go.
And if you have, I already see folks are dropping questions in the chat, so please, we welcome all the questions that you have. These are ways of following the work, and I'll turn it back over to Matt.
Thank you, Clarence and Marika. Wow, those case studies are powerful examples of why community engagement is not a nice to have thing or something you check off. It can come back to get you, and like meaningful engagement on this topic is, yeah, seems like the only way to roll this stuff out. So thanks for your work. We're just going to share a few last resources that you can take and use. If any of this conversation has interested you today and you want to do more meaningful community engagement around AI rollouts, or you want to audit AI that's already rolled out, we've got some resources for you. The first is in this Civic Tech Field Guide. We are tracking civic and public sector AI everywhere we see it. We've been doing that for some years now. So that includes AI for engaging the public itself. Like that act is developers rolling out AI to do that. Within GovTech, the public sector examples we talked about today with open civic data on political campaigns, AI is increasingly there. And then within journalism and fighting disinformation, we're seeing AI on both sides of the equations. So some code you can find there, some other case studies, and some organizations you can find all at civictech.guide/AI. That's where it's all aggregated. And then we have a couple of resources from Eticas that we want to share, and I'll turn over to Youngshen for these.
Yes. So SECAS has produced an external auditing guide called Guide to Algorithmic Auditing before. You can access it through this link. And I suppose that Rebecca will also share that in the follow-up email. Basically, what it does is that it allows people to from affected communities to any independent auditor from the AI developers to work together and create an algorithmic audit. It walks you through all the steps, which are too much to be presented during this call. It's like 9 steps. And it includes a lot of details. I will also share later with Rebecca another source that we have created, which is an improvement on the algorithmic auditing guide, but features a lot more on how exactly you can engage with communities and the reasons for engaging with them. It's like a V1.5 of the algorithmic auditing guide. And the next slide will be another really great resource is that Eticas has created an open source library, Python library, for anyone who wishes to test an algorithmic system. And I don't know if we can scroll down. Sorry, we can't share here.
Screenshot,
But
sorry.
no, it's okay. But all the way down there, you can find the workflow of an algorithmic system from the development of it to being processed and to like post deployment. You can test the training data. You can test the production data, which is when the market goes live and you get in more data. And you can test the performance of the system at the training stage and also after the training stage. And you can also customize the AI library for anything that you want to test particularly. So it's quite flexible.
Yeah, really cool that that's open source. So that's at github.com/eticasai. And again, Rebecca will be sending these links out to everybody. So now we'd love to open it up to questions and discussion. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see those questions. But thanks to all our speakers. Just scanning for some questions here. Great chat. Looking for things with question marks. Okay, Swazik, have you had any difficulties in identifying community organizations and creating the necessary trust with them? Great question.
I would like to actually dig into that question and flip it out just a little bit. Because what we actually have found is that systems, cities, counties, organizations already usually have their go-to, and sometimes we perceive them as gatekeepers. And so to the point of it takes a while to build trust, and we need to build trust at the speed of, we call it moving at the speed of capacity, building trust at the speed of capacity. And so, again, being a proactive piece is actually mapping out what are the community organizations, who are their constituencies, what are the communities that they serve, and with intention, reaching out to them to build community with them before you even are thinking about a particular project or grant that you're pursuing. Because again, a lot of what we've seen with cities and organizations is they already have the grant, they've got the agenda, and then they say, hey, we need you to fill this gap for us here. And so really it is about building the muscle of organizations and systems to do that in advance. And what I will also say about that is, in addition to building the muscle, it's also about interrupting the intimidation that systems feel about engaging with community and being comfortable with community providing feedback and resisting, because you cannot have an authentic conversation if you cannot receive critique or questions from the community itself. And so really getting ahead and laying that groundwork and having a conversation about what is the relationship with the system or this organization with community is the way to lay the groundwork to actually successfully partner and build that trust.
Yeah. There's another difficult question here. How can we effectively audit AI systems when even AI professionals admit that no one fully understands what's happening inside them? Does anyone want to take a crack at that one? I'm looking at Young Shuen's direction.
Sorry, could you quickly restate that again? I
Yeah,
lost track in
how can
the
we
chat.
effectively audit AI systems if, even AI professionals say we don't know what's happening inside those systems sometimes? Or also,
Uh,
from Etika's perspective, you might be, with the case of a community-led audit, you might not be inside the system itself. You're just looking at what comes in, what goes out, right?
yes, definitely. And I think it depends on exactly what we're looking at here. There is the academic literature on I wish to get this right. I think mechanistic interpretation or interpretability, that's trying to understand exactly the internal workings of a model and then how you can view from the performance or output of the model to see the logic and reasoning hiding behind, sort of. Um, but on our side, when we're doing AI auditing, we're looking very squarely at the social impacts of the models themselves. So actually, most of the time, we focus just on the output itself. You throw in some input in there, and then you can do like controlled experiments with a group with a certain characteristic or variable and another group with a different characteristic. And you can compare how this model performs for the both of them. Once you understand this, you can start tracing back to design choices, probably, or maybe issues within the data itself. Maybe it was the framing of the data sets that actually created a different ground truth for the model to work on. So there are many ways to go about it without you being able to fully understand the working of the system. Um, it's not to say that we shouldn't improve on explainability. And actually, I think that's quite an important criteria that would enable ethical and responsible AI, because you have to explain exactly the decision-making processes and transparency with that. But at the same time, you can still figure out the problems and investigate it accordingly without having full explainability, just as you would with humans. Sometimes you don't really understand all of our reasonings, but still you can look at the impacts that it has.
Thank you for that. We have some homework reading. Greta?
Yeah, thank you. I was gonna ask Dan McQuillan to say a little bit more. I see that you've asked a couple of times about abolition, and with some critiques of what I think sounds like sort of technocratic approaches to AI auditing. So I'd love to just hear you say out loud what you're thinking.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to speak. Yeah, I mean, I'd say, sorry, I was maybe making some sarcastic comments in the chat about interpretability, but I just wanted to clarify that because there's a few things going on at the same time here. We've got the latest, as was really clearly explained at the beginning. You've got a few different kinds of AI, and the latest one, which is rolling us all over, is generative AI, and that is based on fundamentally on technologies, as I put something in the chat about it, that nobody understands, including the people who are making it. And that is a major problem for any claims towards interpretability or accountability or anything else. I mean, to me, that's pretty much a red flag, for the fact that this stuff should not be applied anywhere that has substantive consequences for anyone's life, really. And in actual fact, I would really strongly caution against using it for anything lower down the food chain. I personally would be very wary of using any of these tools for summarizing documents or consulting the public or any of that kind of thing. I mean, they're really very, very foundational problems with that kind of AI. But the other thing I wanted to say was that all of these systems, because there are kinds of machine learning that are actually much more, amenable. You can actually look inside decision trees or whatever and say, okay, that was the bit of the algorithm that led to the mistake or whatever, or that contributed towards the bias. And so the second point I'd like to make is really that um, all of these things are really based on the wrong premise. Most of the things we're talking about are far too complex to be predictable in this way, and that systems that claim to be doing predictive analytics are profoundly misleading and actually accidentally or deliberately diverting, as I think's been made really clear by the speakers today, from what the actual problems, social and structural problems are, and also what knowledge is already out there within the communities and also within, some of the professionals and some of the services about what could be done to fix them. So I guess I am in for both of these, or for these reasons and others, arguing that absolutely applauding all the community consultation and engagement stuff that's been described today, but just really questioning whether uh, the angle taken really should be for making better systems, or just saying these things are really a priori a mistake in themselves and
Great.
should be, we should have alternatives.
Thank you for for that provocation, Dan. And I just wanted to say, I feel like I want to hand this one to Clarence. Um, but I wanted to also say that we are in a situation where, I mentioned that the field of AI auditing is emergent. And what we're seeing globally is that most of the resources and attention are going towards what I'd call the more technocratic auditing. And what we're really trying to say here is that, with systems, for example, where we don't know what's going on inside the model, that it's absolutely critical to be looking at what happens on the ground as a way to inform like a reasonable handling of these systems. But I want to hand off to Clarence as well.
Yeah, and I think both building off of that and kind of responding to some of the questions specifically around kind of how do we navigate this dynamic of the limitations of auditing as a framework, thinking about like how do we navigate this new kind of political terrain that we're experiencing, where we're seeing these technologies being intentionally and purposefully being weaponized against communities. One way that I kind of reconcile some of those questions, at least for myself, is thinking about this, about these methods as bearing witness, as a method of kind of gathering and surfacing the evidence necessary to be able to both expose what these systems are, what they're doing, and to kind of give us a foundation in the future, right, to be able to actually do kind of create the types of systems transformation that not only remedy and redress the harms that have happened, but can kind of really help us create conditions for building the futures that we want. I think about this work like in the lineage of folks like Ida B. Wells and the Red Record, where you're dealing with a time in the South in the early 20th century, where there's prolific lynchings happening and there's no type of formal legal redress that's available, but it's important in those contexts to still build the record. And I think we're dealing with a similar moment now in the United States at the very least, where a lot of the policy and legal avenues that we would normally turn to be able to actually get redress are closed, but it's still important for us to bear witness, to build the record, to get that evidence marshaled so that in the future we can actually achieve both redress and systems transformation.
These are fantastic points. This is open to everyone, especially the speakers. Given that we know that AI, both generative AI systems and automated decision-making systems, are being rolled out on top of the public right now by various GovTech vendors and also in-house in government, at what point in the AI technology adoption lifecycle does it make sense to do an audit or to intervene in some way if you are in the public sector? And maybe it's not an either or, but
I'll take that one to start with. So I think our municipal leaders are dealing with I'm sorry, how long do we have to go here? Because I see that we're at one.
We have officially ended at 1. Anyone who can and wants to stay on a little bit longer to do some Q&A, I'll be here. And whoever wants to be on, feel free to stay on.
Okay, great. And for those of you who are leaving us, thank you so much for coming. It's been I've loved listening to all my co-presenters, and thank you so much to National Civic League for hosting. But I was gonna say, I think many leaders, both in municipal government, all kinds of, state government, and also nonprofit leaders, civil society leaders, are in a position where they're being asked to implement AI, and they may not have much background in it or really understand the implications, um, and are really struggling to even figure out like how do we govern this? Like if we're going to roll out AI, like who's in charge and how do we set up standards and how do we make rules for acceptable use and all kinds of stuff like that. And so I think to the question of um when should communities be consulted? I would say early and often, right? Because this can't be done overnight. Right. This can't be something where you weren't using generative AI to do a thing and now you're going to use it. We have to deeply understand social context. And so I feel like what we have right now is this kind of like competing set of incentives where um there's this incentive to roll out AI really quickly and kind of move fast and break things. And then on the other hand, we know that things will go wrong and there will be real harm if that happens. And moreover, like Clarence said, I think there's also the hopeful side of it, which is what is the society we want and need? Like what is the future with technology that will be beneficial and good and will raise all boats? And so yeah, I'm gonna say early and often and really understand the social context before you start applying AI to a question or a problem.
Thanks, Greta. And yeah, I don't think I caught the word procurement process, but I'm inspired by the work of Clarence and Marika and others at TCIA and their colleagues who did the Stop Shot Spotter work, where they were able to work with cities during the procurement phase of buying a new technology or even renewing the contract to then do an audit in that case and show how it's technically not a great product, doesn't do what it says or doesn't do it well. And then it helps us get away from this point that you brought up, Greta, of like, we're not doing audits to perfect these technical surveillance systems. We're doing them to stop buying them, right? So I'll drop a link in the chat to that work.
I think I am going to go ahead and wrap us up now. As I mentioned at the top of the call, we have been recording the recording slides. Any resources mentioned will be sent out to the email address you registered under. There's also going to be a quick survey that will be in that email. Among the questions that we will briefly ask you is if there is interest in a future webinar going a step further on this topic. So please do feel free to chime in on whether or not you'd like to hear more. I want to take just a very brief moment to thank all of our speakers for your time and expertise sharing on this topic. Matt and Greta came to me with this idea a few months back, and we were able to pull it together really quickly. I know we were not able to, speak as detailed as we would like. There's a lot to cover, so we are contemplating making this a series. So please chime in on that survey if you would like to hear more. Clarence and Marika, thank you so much for providing the case studies and for the work that the deep work that you are doing in communities. And thank you for all of you for giving us an hour of your important time. We host this webinar series monthly on a range of different democracy innovation topics. So if you like what you heard today, feel free to subscribe to our newsletter and join us for a future webinar topic. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.